I'm going to talk about my parents, Donald and Elizabeth, known as Bessie, Davidson. My father came to Ravenstone. My father, prior to coming to Ravenstone, was in the First World War with the Inverness Highland Battery of the Royal Horse Artillery. And he was in Palestine for virtually the whole of his service in the First World War, dealing with horses and gun carriages, etc. It seems ancient history now. And after the war, because he signed up when he was 18, after the war, he trained as a mechanical engineer in Glasgow. He was born in Inverness, and he got apprenticed to an engineering firm in Glasgow and did his studies at the Royal Technical College in Glasgow, now known as Strathclyde University. But he was extremely proud of his experience and his qualifications. He met my mother on walking weekends in the late 20s and early 30s with a group of young people, mixed group of young people, walking on the South Downs and staying in public houses which had accommodation for walkers. When Dad got a permanent job at Pegson's Engineering Company in Colville, Leicestershire, they made quarrying machinery. There were a lot of quarries in this area, granite quarries. And so my father got lodgings in Leecroft House in the early 1930s. And because he then had a permanent job, he was able to afford to take on a wife. And so he and my mother got married on the 8th of September 1934 in Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church in Ashby. A Roman Catholic Irish woman marrying a Scottish Presbyterian, which in those days was not very common. But Mother had got permission from a priest, a Jesuit priest, based in the Farm Street, very famous Catholic church in Mayfair. So she had a clear conscience because Catholics had to apply for permission to marry. And she married with his blessing to marry her Scotsman and have a happy life. So they lived in Swannington. My father left Leecroft House and they lived in a house on Station Hill, Swannington, during the first year of their marriage. But my sister was born in August 1935 and at Leecroft House. So they, at some time during 1935, they came back and took over Leecroft House, which was part of the Fosbrook estate. Dad had said to Mr. Watts, who gave him the accommodation before he married, to let him know if he ever left, because he liked the house so much. And this year, just now, we are in the process of selling it after 90 years. But war broke out, as you know, in 1939. And refugees from Birmingham came, and my parents offered accommodation, and two sisters came from Birmingham and were here for 6 months, and then realised that Birmingham wasn't going to be bombed wasn't being bombarded at the beginning of the war, and they went back to Birmingham. But one of them said to Mum, Mrs. Davidson, she was Mrs. Davidson by that time, she had been Miss Courtney, and could you possibly go and see a Belgian woman billeted in the stables at the rear of Ravenstone Hall with her 4 children? She's desperate to get some accommodation. And so my mother went forth, met Madame Van Luke, and immediately said, yes, we have space, you see. And so Madame Van Luke was very relieved at this, and saw the size of the house, and said to her, do you think you could accommodate my sister-in-law? She's got 3 boys and her mother. So the house was fully occupied, you might say, by Madame Suter, who lived on the top floor with her 3 slightly older boys. Her mother had a little room halfway up the stairs, Madame Ferrier, and she had her own open fire. Everybody cooked over the open fire in those days. There were no electric cookers. I think we did have an electric kettle, but you lit the fire early in the morning. I think my parents, and I've still got it, were given a copper electric kettle as a wedding present. But I've never seen it being used, but there's a lot of fur inside the kettle today, so it must have been well used. And so just with an open fire, these 2 Belgian families moved in. And the geography of the house lent itself to them never having to come through our family quarters. They could go out into the garden, and out in the garden we had a 2-seater dry toilet in a special little house that was built for it, probably a couple of 100 years before. So the boys were always told not to come into the house to go to the toilet, but to go to the outside toilet. So it was very much used in those days. For 5 years, we had the Belgian families, and never any arguments, except one day. It was springtime, and my father was a keen gardener. He grew all the vegetables and had fruit trees. He grew vegetables for everybody in the house. He had a lovely display of tulips, but the young Belgian twins, who were 2 when they came, they'd have been about 3.5 to 4 years, they picked the heads off all the daffodils one day, and their mother was so upset. What would Mr. Davidson say at his beautiful tulips being picked with just a 1/2-inch stalk on the heads? But fortunately, when he came, he could see the funny side of it and laughed and said, boys will be boys, and that was that, the end of the story. But I suspect she was afraid that they might get turfed out. When the menfolk came home, my father would take them round to the Plough Inn. Rebecca's grandfather was mine host in the Plough Inn in those days, Amos Kendrick, very well known, very musical, and ran a very good public house. And my father would take the Belgian men round to the pub for some relaxation and talk to other men and so forth. And they never, ever, during the whole 5 years, had to buy a drink for themselves. The miners, the miners and the village people always bought drinks for the Belgians and my father. And it brings tears to my eyes now to think of that generosity of spirit. They not only were fighting to free up Belgium and France and Europe, but they'd had to leave their homes as well and bring their families and live as refugees. And so that was always appreciated by my family and the Belgians. And, and all sorts of little reciprocal arrangements. We had hens, and people would come round and ask my mother, could you spare an egg, Johnny's? And my mother would give them the egg and exhort them not to mention a word to anybody, because the authorities would be down. Because we sold, my uncle, who'd been gassed in the First World War, he ran a chicken establishment for the eggs, which they sold to the ministry. And of course, you couldn't then be seen to be giving eggs away. So that was all hush-hush. But different families would come, could you spare an egg? And, it was quietly dispatched and carefully got and nobody said a word. And I was born 9 months after the Belgians had settled in. So I was a little girl born into the family with 7 boys. So I must have been fussed and petted and so on an awful lot in those days. And one Christmas, there was a knock at the door. A few days before Christmas, there was a knock at the door. And blackout, remember, blackout. So no street lighting, no lighting from your house. My father went to the door, and a policeman stood outside asking for Madame Van Luke. Madame Van Luke, well, they knew that she lived here. Could he speak to Madame Van Luke? So Madame Van Luke came from her room, worried sick. Policeman was asking for her. So she got to the door, and the policeman said, "Do you recognize this man?" Her brother. His ship had been torpedoed 6 months before, and they never heard whether he was alive or dead. They could only assume that he was dead. And he got there, station in Colville, train from London, Leicester, Colville, went to the police station and walked with the policeman. Policeman had his bicycle, walked with the policeman from Colville to the house. Never been heard of for 6 months, but the policeman had to prove that he was, who he said he was, a Belgian sailor. He worked in merchant navy, and he had a little slip of paper, Leecroft House, Ravenstone, which he'd kept with him all the time, or he'd got it, but he knew that he had to come. And the policeman came out, and there was great... The noise would have woken the whole of Ravenstone, I think, at the reunion. That's having him arrive safely and alive. And her brother and another brother was married to the woman upstairs, you see. So it was one big, big family. So that was a lovely occasion.